Let me guess, you're here because you heard all about Euro nymphing, how it's this incredible technique that's used to catch a lot of fish, right? But you may also have a problem because you probably also heard there's a very steep learning curve and it can be difficult to catch all those fish. I'm here to help you solve that problem. You want to know the secret? Try these 5 tips and you are guaranteed to catch more trout or your money back. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Tim Cammisa from troutandfeather.com, and yes, I am addicted to Euro nymphing. I've been doing it for years. I've gone down every single rabbit hole of it. Heck, I even wrote a book on Euro nymphs. More on that later. And I can tell you, whenever I first got into European nymphing, it was very, very difficult. I didn't know what I didn't know. But now fast forward all these years, and I've kind of sort of figured a few things out, and I'm here to help share them with you as well. And in no particular order, let me get to these 5 secrets that are gonna help you catch more fish today. The cast matters. What do I mean by that? I mean, gone are the days where we're just basically using that windshield wiper to go back and forth, or this giant weight to kind of chuck out there and get it to land somewhere on the water. I don't know, that whole adage like, hey, if it catches fish, it's good enough, that's BS, and I don't buy into it. I've realized over the years that that fly placement matters. Sometimes I want it to land just in that certain inch or centimeter of drift. If I'm fishing 2 flies, I want to know exactly how they're going to land and how they're going to interact with one another. There are times I want to make a cast and I don't want my leader to touch the water at all. Whereas other times I wanted to make a cast and I want my leader to straighten out the whole way down to my nymph. So what does this all mean? Here are 3 casts that you should start practicing starting right now. The water load. So when you're on moving water, you let all of your line, your leader, your fly all go straight down below you. Keep a low rod tip, a low rod angle, and you want to just drive that rod upstream and just kind of flick it. My friend Josh Miller says it's kind of like throwing a Frisbee where you just flick this line. And whenever you flick that rod tip, it's going to grab onto all of that line, all of that leader, and that water is going to resist. That's the water load part. That's going to help bend your rod one direction. Once that water starts to let go, you start to lift your rod just ever so gently, then all of that's going to shoot away and go in the direction of your rod tip. The water load is a great cast to practice right now. What about those of you who use a micro thin leader? Maybe that leader started to wrap around the tip top of your rod. You thought, that could just be bad leader material. Sure, or it could be something else. I had that problem a couple times and I shot my buddy a quick text message. Devin Olson of Tactical Fly Fisher got back to me immediately and he said, hey Tim, it's your cast. Instead, he recommended that I try the Belgian or the oval cast, and that straightened everything out. Why did that cast work? If you think about your traditional cast, you go back, stop, and then forward. That start-stopping motion causes that really thin leader to just have things go haywire. So instead with this Belgian or oval cast, you are constantly keeping everything in motion. That leader, that tippet, that fly, they never stop. It's constantly just a go, 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 go until you release. But the other key is that you're not just going back and forward, back and forward. That would cause things to just knot up, AKA the wind knot. Instead, you're gonna make an oval shape with your rod tip. That's always gonna be moving and that's gonna help you out. Start practicing that cast ASAP if you fish the micro thin leader. And then one you may already know about is called the tuck cast. Basically, as you're coming forward with your rod, you're bringing your rod forward, you just pop it back just a little bit. And by doing that quick pop motion, it's gonna cause your fly and your tippet to speed up and jump in front of your leader. That allows them to dive into the water really quickly, which means your fly is gonna get right down to where it needs to be, and then you can start your drift. The tuck cast is a really great one to use when you have fast and deep water and you know those fish are tucked in close to the bottom. If the fish are suspended a little bit higher up in the column, the tuck cast may not be the right one to use, because as soon as you make that tuck and your fly starts to dive down into the water, you lose contact for a set period of time. If that fish eats while your fly is dropping, you have no idea it happens. You start your drift and you're none the wiser. So make sure you're using the tuck cast in a situation where it's okay to lose contact with your fly for X amount of time. Take me to your leader. In the world of Euro nymphing, the leader makes all the difference. From thick to thin, from long to short. All right, I'm gonna try to stay appropriate here. You're gonna realize if you do a Google search of Euro leaders, there are way too many to comprehend. What's that mean for all of us? That means we have to find the right leader that matches our fishing style, the waters that we fish, and what we're trying to get out of it. I can also really recommend that for a beginner Euro nympher, you may want to go with something that I would call a thicker leader versus one of these micro thin ones. The thicker leaders are great because they help to turn over heavier flies. You can also get away with turning over really light flies, and it's great to use for dry flies. I have a leader that I use called my Pat Weiss leader. It's a thicker leader. It's a great one. I can also use it whenever I want to float the leader. But what about something called the micro thin leader? That's something I use whenever I need a complete increase in sensitivity. That really offers me almost no sag from my rod tip down to where the fly enters the water. It's a much more responsive leader. Sometimes I'll even feel through the leader when a fish eats. A key for the micro thin leader is that whenever I cast my fly to a certain drift, my fly tends to stay in that drift longer than if I'm using a thicker leader, something like a mono style rig. So whenever I'm using lighter flies and I want to make my fly stay in that drift without sacrificing and putting on more weight, that's when I go with a micro thin leader. That's the one I tend to use right now. I've been using one for the last couple seasons and it works really well. Going back to, however, you gotta have the right cast for it. So where does that leave you? Very simple. Shoot me an email. It's on the screen right now, tcammisa@gmail.com, and I will send you a list of what I deem to be the best leaders to use for Euro nymphing today. I'll send you the Pat Weiss leader, I'll send you my micro thin leader, and I'll even send you one that you can just buy that's ready-made. So you have the option. However, my advice is start with a little bit of a thicker leader, then eventually work yourself down to a micro thin leader, get comfortable using 2 or 3 different styles, and then pick the right one based on your fishing that day. Keep your eyes on the prize. What I'm trying to say is that Euro nymphing is very visual. I used to read these books that talked about the master nymph fly fishers of the day, and they just had this sixth sense to set the hook whenever they had a fish on. I'm not sure how true that is, because for me and for so many of the anglers I interviewed for my book, they have to see something that tells them, hey, there's a fish that just ate. I recognize that fish ate and I'm gonna set the hook. What did they see? When you look down your rod and you see your leader going between the guides, there's always a little bit of a sag in there. At times, I'll be watching that sag and it will straighten out. Set the hook. That could be a fish. That same sag exists from your rod tip to where your fly enters that water. Whenever you see that sag and it starts to straighten, set the hook. That could be a fish. What about the line? You've probably heard of this cider material. I have some on right here for the back end of my leader. It's multicolor. That helps me see it a little bit better depending on the background. But if I see something happening with that line, it moves one way or another, I set the hook. The same thing applies for the front end of my leader. I use this material called Sempe. You're looking at a picture right now of it. I have links to buy it down below in the description of this video. But that's a really nice high-vis color. I prefer pink or chartreuse. And I tie that the whole way down to my tippet. So I can watch that Sempe, I can see what's going on with it. If during the drift it's going one direction and it kind of pauses, yet I didn't pause, set the hook. If it reverses, set the hook. If it gets pulled down, set the hook. If it does anything weird, set the hook. But I'm always watching the end of my Sempe, where my leader meets my tippet, to see if something different's happening. My tippet is typically longer than the depth of the water that I'm fishing that day. That way I only have that fine scientific angler's tippet going into the water. But sometimes when I'm fishing a little bit skinnier water, my Sempe material is really far off from where that line meets the water, where that tippet meets the water. So what do I key on? Somewhere on that tippet, I will take some of this neon wax and spread it all over the tippet. What that means is now I've just created some cider material in line in my tippet. For this neon wax, I like colors like chartreuse, hot orange, high-vis pink, stuff that I can recognize when it's in the water. And when I'm making my drift, I can concentrate on that neon wax. If that neon wax jumps backwards, forwards, dives down, goes up, does anything different, I set the hook. And then finally, use a strike indicator. It's okay if you call it a bobber as well. But there are times I want to make a really far cast. I'll use that strike indicator, A, to help my line get out there, and then B, to help my fly stay in that drift. Because if I'm using that micro thin leader, I can hold all of that leader off of the water. I don't have to worry about mending my line or doing any of that stuff. Instead, I'm holding tight to my strike indicator, which is directly connected to my fly. As it's making its drift, as it's moving downstream, I'm watching that indicator to see if anything's happening. If anything happens to that indicator, it goes down, pauses, twists, set the hook. And then finally, and most importantly, if you see something happen in the water, if you see a fish flash or move or a mouth open, set the hook as well, because that is like the direct link you have to the fish. Euro nymphing is so visual, and take advantage of everything that you see going on while you're fishing. Please pause and like this video. By doing that, you're telling me that you like this style video and you want to see more of these in the future. Thank you so much ahead of time. Variety is the spice of life. Yes, I know it's called Euro nymphing. However, you can throw dry flies, dry dropper, articulated streamers, jig streamers, salmon flies. You can throw whatever you want off of this rig. If I'm throwing just a solo dry fly, yes, I have to change my leader to my Pat Weiss leader, but it's a highly sensitive, highly effective technique to do so. I use my micro thin leader for a dry dropper setup where I have a dry fly coming off the dropper and I have a small to medium sized nymph on the point. And when I'm throwing articulated or jig streamers, I just ramp up my tippet. Heck, even when I'm fishing in the Great Lakes tributaries for those steelhead, AKA those big rainbow trout, I'm still using a Euro nymph setup. Sure, I'm not throwing a 2 or a 3 weight anymore, but I'm still gonna use that Euro nymph leader that will throw those flies to give me a much better drift than I would with a traditional setup. I take multiple trips to Iceland every year. I host fly fishing trips there. We're going after Atlantic salmon. Yes, you can use a Euro nymph setup on Atlantic salmon too. Variety is the spice of life, and this setup is not just to use Euro nymphs whenever you're out trout fishing. Try other flies, try other species with this setup. It's gonna work for you. And finally, the one you've been waiting for. The dirty secret of Euro nymphing is you're basically just a spin fisherman, but you already knew that, right? All right, I'm just kidding. Kinda. Control what you can control. You can control the leader setup, all the knots that you tied, your placement before making the cast, your actual cast. You can also control how few rod movements you're gonna make with your hand, especially during that drift. By controlling those movements, there's gonna be less wiggle on the end of your line. And you know what happens when there's wiggle? When there's wiggle, you can't see your indicator. You can't see that sempé or that lipstick. Your line's moving too much. You don't recognize when there's an eat. But whenever you're controlling everything, you're making smooth movements and you're watching your line with very little rod wiggle, you can identify an eat much quicker. What else helps with that? A lightweight rod with very fast rod recovery. There's a reason I use the Master Nymph fly rods. I think they're some of the best out there today. But then think what happens next. You have those steady hands. You see an eat. You make a wrist set, very smooth wrist set. There's no fish there. That's okay. You already have your body in the right placement. You can just lead that set into your cast and get your fly placed down right where you want it in that next drift, getting ready for that next potential fish. Sure, this comes from practice and experience, but it also comes from being very intentional whenever you're out fishing. So the next time you're on the water Euro nymphing and you see your rod tip wiggle, think to yourself, I have a problem. How do I fix that problem? How do I reduce the amount of wiggle? Because if it's not wiggling, I have a better chance of figuring out when that fish just ate. And does the rod matter? You're darn right it does. Look down below in the description of this video, and I have a link to a blog that I wrote all about Euro nymphing rods. So how did I figure out these Euro nymphing secrets? Well, it wasn't just by luck. I've done a heck of a lot of homework, time on the water, experience talking with others over the years. And then as I mentioned, I recently wrote a book on Euro nymphs. If you're into Euro nymphing, you are going to love this book because not only do I feature some of today's top Euro nymphs, I also pick the brains of some of today's top Euro nymph anglers. We're talking over 25 fly fishers and tyers talking about nothing more than Euro nymphs. Names like Devin Olson, George Daniel, Josh Miller, Lance Egan, Lubos Rozo, Howard Croston. I even got Tom Rosenbauer to talk about Euro nymphs, and he never talks about Euro nymphs. But more than just talking about the Euro nymphs, each one of these anglers also shared their own confidence list of flies. So you're hearing from everybody about the flies that they're fishing right now. There's a link down below in the description of this video to buy your very own autographed copy. Thank you ahead of time. All right, you just got my secrets of Euro nymphing. We're finished, right? Of course not. If you look on the screen right now, a playlist of videos just appeared. Those are all of my videos on YouTube about Euro nymphing. Click that playlist, get back to learning, enjoy all those videos, and you can thank me later.